Welcome back to AM Northwest. At the age of 25, our next guest began a career in organic farming and in the process uncovered a piece of her own Indian heritage. Here to share her beautiful story, we welcome the author of On Gold Hill, Jaclyn Moyer. Good to have you with us. It is a beautiful book, well written. It's your memoir, essentially. But tell us how you use your memoir to talk about your connection to your Indian heritage.
Yeah, and thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah.
So the book, it really grew out of my experience farming in the foothills in California. And pretty early into our first season, we encountered a variety of heirloom wheat called Sonora. And as we started to look into possibly growing this wheat, I learned that it not only had a long history in California, but also in the region of northern India where my mother's from, and the rest of my family as far back as anyone knows. And
that
so,
must have been, I mean, when you hear that for the first time, you're kind of a little shocked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great coincidence, and it really, you know, for most of my life, I grew up somewhat severed from my cultural heritage. I didn't learn the language, and I'd always sort of longed, I think, for a way to connect to that part of my history. And so, yeah, when I stumbled upon this connection, it immediately struck me as perhaps a possibility to kind of forge a connection with that part of my past.
Right. Well, and you talked too, because about your mom came to the States when she was 15, right?
Yep.
And then she married an American, white American,
Yeah.
which your grandfather didn't care for initially.
Right.
So tell that story, because he was going to ask, your dad was going to ask for your mom's hand in marriage, and your grandfather was just livid.
Yeah, yeah. So my dad, I think my mom had some sense that this might be his reaction, but my dad was, he was kind of a more idealist hippie, you know, had this notion that, you know, love will overcome, and I'll just call him up and explain, you know, that we're in love, and he'll understand that. And so that's what he did, and my grandfather did not understand. And my grandfather, you know, I think the conversation was very short, and then he hung up the phone, and then he sort of pledged that he was going to kill my parents in this sort of honor way. And I don't know how serious, you know, he was about that in the moment, but it was definitely, I think, scary for everyone involved. And it did mark the beginning of kind of a chasm in, you know, between my mother and her grandparents that lasted several years, where they disowned her for a while. And but by the time my sister and I were born, my sister's a couple years older, they had repaired that relationship, and my grandparents had kind of welcomed her back into the family. But I think that experience did discourage my mother, in those years anyway, from really embracing her culture and bringing it into our lives, so she didn't.
And pass that along to you.
Right.
So when you discover this wheat, how does it bring you back to your heritage? So tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, so we started growing the wheat, and early on, the woman we bought the seed from, she runs sort of a nonprofit dedicated to kind of promoting these old landrace grains, and she had done a bunch of research into all these different grains, and she had learned through people she talked to and through tracing the history that this variety had also been grown in Punjab. And so
which is where your family's from.
Right. And some people that she had talked to had said, oh yeah, it makes these roti, these like traditional Punjabi flatbreads that are like just like what we remember from our childhood. And so I thought, wow, if I can like grow this wheat, produce the flour, like could I bring it to my grandmother and she could, you know, make bread from it? And
wouldn't that be something? Yeah.
And so over the course of the years of growing it, you know, it wasn't quite as easy as I had imagined. And I spent a lot of time with my grandmother asking her, you know, usually intending to talk to her about the wheat or what, you know, what she remembers from the wheat growing up, and if it was different and if the breads were different. And often and because of our limited shared language, she speaks English, but it's very limited, and I speak very little Punjabi. So often our conversations were going through my mother translating. And so in that way, I learned stories that I had never heard, but also that my mother had never heard. So it was a really interesting experience of all three of us sort of learning about our family past in a way that had never been shared.
What stands out to you as something that you learned that you will pass on to your kids?
A big part of the story was my grandparents' experience going through the partition of India. And my grandmother was, I think, about 8, and my grandfather was closer to 15, and that was a hugely traumatic event in all of their lives,
Right.
and they had never spoken of it to their children. And so when they both shared that story through my grandmother's translation, it was the first time, of course, that I had heard it, but it was also the first time that she had heard it. And I think us all understanding kind of what that experience meant for their lives helped
Right.
everyone sort of put into context these other questions about their lives and our family history.
What an incredible story! And did it tighten even more your bonds with your mom? Like,
It did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it really did. And then when my daughter was born on the farm, for the first few years of her life, my mother only spoke in Punjabi to her. So I think we all, through the experience of kind of learning about our family history, and we all went back to India together during those years, she kind of rekindled her desire to pass on some of that culture.
Right.
So my daughter now, I mean, she doesn't quite speak it, but she definitely understands more than I did.
I love that. I
So
love that.
yeah.
You have a book event tonight at Powell's,
Yeah.
and you're in conversation with
Michelle Nyhouse.
Awesome.
Yeah, a really
the book
amazing
again
writer.
is titled On Gold Hill, and the book event is at tonight at Powell City Books at 7 o'clock tonight on Burnside. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much
Fascinating
for having
story.
me on.
All right, we'll be right back with more AM Northwest. Don't go away.